Welcome to the High Performance Hockey Podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Pat Davidson. Pat is an independent trainer, consultant, author, and lecturer in New York City. Pat is the former director of training methodology and continuing education for Peak Performance and a former professor of exercise science at Springfield College and Brooklyn College. Pat has also been a former 175-pound strongman competitor who finished in the top 10 in the U.S. twice, competed in 2 world championships, and finished in the top 10 in the world at one point. Pat is interested in all realms of the human organism and human improvement and is relentless in pursuing education and continuing education. A fantastic episode that we have with Pat. In it, we speak about the Wizard of Oz. We talk about biomechanics, mentors, movement algorithms, and the field of strength and conditioning. It's a fantastic episode. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Pat. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I mean, it's really a pleasure for me to be able to join you. I think that this is a mutual admiration club we got here. So
I remember meeting you for the first time, I think live in person at a PRI clinic in Columbus, Ohio. I caught up with you also at a Robertson training system. Mike Robertson put a clinic on in Indianapolis at the time. And I remember being taken back by a combination for you of walking the talk, being built like a brick shithouse, training, and then a really, really deep side in terms of your critical thinking, something I super, super respect about you and what you put out in social media. So I want to start by giving you a compliment on walking the talk, but also really doing the due diligence and being a really, really strong critical thinker in our field. And quite frankly, I'll say this, I think a lot of times when I turn on social media, there's echo chambers, there's parrots, right? And I say parrots not in a negative way. You have to have mentors, etc. But I really like your stance on certain things, and I like the way you think and the way you question yourself and the way you question others.
That's a very nice compliment. Thank you for saying that. I do get that feedback about critical thinking. Like, I've taught online mentorships, and it's funny because I always ask them at the end for some feedback, and they're like, well, it's interesting. Like, I guess this was a mentorship on exercise science and program design, but in reality, it felt more like 10 weeks of just critical thinking work, like a workshop on critical thinking. And I was like, well, I guess everything should be that, shouldn't it? So I think to myself, like, the way that I was raised probably plays into that in a major, major way. I was raised as a young child by my grandparents, and my grandfather was born in 1914 and my grandmother was born in 1915. They were just really like no bullshit people that were raised in the Boston area and grew up during the Great Depression. And, my grandfather at a very young age, he was the oldest of, I think 6, and his father contracted polio, and he basically had to be the man of the family starting at like 11 years old. You know what I mean? So he didn't really have a childhood. He just had to be a man. Yep. And, he had to be a longshoreman working on the docks in Boston as a child, basically. He was just a tough old bastard, really, but, smart as a whip. And, I think that the messages I received as a child were oftentimes like, hey, don't be a goddamn idiot. What were you thinking doing something like that? Like, open your eyes, look at what's in front of you. Why do you take everything that everyone else has to say as fact? Like, just be a critical thinker, like analyze things, what's actually in front of you, But I got to tell you, I probably heard "don't be a goddamn fool" about 10,000 times. And it was like I was very good at basketball as a young kid, and basketball was like the sport in my neighborhood. And I remember him pulling me aside at some point. He goes, "Hey, listen, I don't know if you notice this about yourself. You're not going to be very tall. You're always going to be white. And it's just not going to happen. Like look at what the world is in front of you. Like, is there anyone like you at the highest level in this sport? No. Be a catcher." And it was kind of like, it was tough to hear that because I think I was like, 9 or something like that.
Yep.
but he was right. You know what I mean? And it's like, I feel like a lot of times people just don't tell you what's blatantly obvious sitting right
Yep.
in front of everyone's face. And it's like they just go along with things for some reason. And
Sure.
I do think we're going to talk about some very old stories that have been around
Yep.
for a while, but I'm a big fan of The Emperor Has No Clothes, and I just feel like there's never been a better time for people to be reminded of that particular story, because I just see it all the time where it's like, whatever this big fish has to say, like all of their, followers or whatever just are like, yes, oh my God, amazing, yes. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. This is absolute lunacy. Is anybody else seeing this but me? And I just think that, like, the moral of that story was that it oftentimes is one person who says something,
Yep.
sticks up with a little bit of courage, and points out, like, what are we all doing? This is crazy. This person doesn't have beautiful threads on, they're naked. I just think nowadays people say things that I don't think ever, like, they make no sense. They're like, if you don't have anything that's necessarily constructive to add to this, just don't say it, or something like that. And I'm like, wait a minute, but, like, there's other ways to look at things as well. Like, I think that we just are identifying what we're looking at, like just actually commenting on our analysis of reality that's sitting in front of us. And this is what I believe I'm seeing. So I think that's just something that's kind of like been in me for a long time. I just think that it's actually becoming inherent, like increasingly rare today in some ways.
Very rare and very important. And let me say this: I would say I'm a big Karl Popper fan. I would consider you a critical rationalist. Critical rationalists don't look at the world and say how it may work. They look at the world and find why it may not work.
Mm,
They doubt leads their inquiry, if that makes sense, which is great.
yeah.
And the other things that you were talking about, the Emperor Has No Clothes, and I'm going to read this verbatim, this Wizard of Oz post that you had that I thought
Mm,
was outstanding, and so many elements that we can ask questions and piggyback questions off of. That is ad populus, ad veracundum. If everyone's saying it, then everyone's going to say it. If Coach X said it, then everyone else is going to say it. So I'm starting, and I'm going to piggyback right here, and I'm going to read a monologue. Probably, and by the way, I'm going to have you plug your social media outlets here at the end of our interview. But if you don't follow, it's a mandatory follow. Training, personal stories, motivation. He and I, like David Goggins, by the way.
mm,
My guy. But I'm reading this because this was probably my favorite post that you ever posted. And then I'm
mm,
going to ask some piggyback quotes.
for
This is
sure.
called The Wizard of Oz. And if you don't know, young coaches, please reference this movie, probably a movie in the mid 70s, but Wizard of Oz. It's one of my favorite stories is The Wizard of Oz. The reason this story resonates with me strongly is because the audience is led to believe that there is an all-powerful magic being who is in complete control of the great city of Oz. There is pomp and ponche. The buildings are large and ornate, decorations over the top. The wizard inside the great tower is practically omnipotent. When we are inside the palace of the wizard and he is awe-inspiring audience at its zenith, the curtain is pulled back and all who are present see this operation as smoke and mirrors. It turns out that the wizard is nothing more than a man. This story is a parable for lessons that we will learn in life. Every situation, every empire, every seemingly invincible juggernaut of an operation is nothing more than a human invention, and it's riddled with human error. My advice to you is to try to avoid meeting your heroes in life because they'll probably disappoint you by not living up to what you had built in their mind. This lesson applies to science, enterprise, technology, and government, to name but a few human-derived systems. When we meet the people at the top of the food chain and you find out what they do and why they do it and the explanations they have, you'll probably come to the realization the world is held together by duct tape and bubble gum, and for the most part, life is a great big shit show. And I have to laugh at some of that. But oh my gosh, that reached out and slapped me for a lot of different reasons. So I'm going to ask, number one, what brought you to write that? And then I want to ask about the science and technology part of this Wizard of Oz.
Mm. I think that I wrote that. It was as part of the early parts of the book that I wrote, A Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement.
Okay?
And I don't remember sometimes what like drives me to write something, but I think it was, the early parts of that book are sort of like my commentary on the industry in some ways. I've met a lot of people at the top of the food chain. I've worked my way to various parts of the top of the food chain. And, almost every single time you get up there, you're kind of like, huh? Like a lot of times you get up to the top of the food chain in pro sports or the Olympic training stuff, and you're just like, this is the person? Like, wow. Huh. You meet like SEC D1 football strength and conditioning coaches or something like that, and you're like, good Lord. I would have thought this would be a little bit better. I think that it's just this is such a natural human thing too. I think it goes to like every level. It even speaks to like, the way that you're going to have realizations about your parents eventually. Every
Sure.
child sees their parents as God, probably because, you're 20 pounds as a little kid and your parents are
Yep.
giants compared to that. And they're
Yep.
eventually you realize they're just people. And I think I mean, everything is really fractal in
Yep.
truth. And I think that just carries on and on and on and on and on. And, I think that part of it is that we crave simple stories and simple explanations as a
Yep.
species. And we really don't like the three-dimensional truth oftentimes. I think overall, there's no other animal on the planet that has the self-awareness that we do. I don't know how they operate. I just know that they don't really think about what they are and how they work. And
Sure.
we do think about what we are and how we work, but we're the only animal probably ever that's actually done that on this planet. And let's face it, like if we're the first, it means we're probably not that good at it. You know what I
Yep.
mean? It's probably such an overwhelming new thing from a life evolutionary perspective that it's probably incredibly painful. I mean, I
Yep.
think it is just in
Yep.
general
Yep.
to have that sort of self analysis. So I think that we have a lot of blinders on and constraints that prevent us from thinking about it too deeply or from we want to see the best in ourselves and we want to see the best in others. And I think that it's funny. I think about a lot of things. Like if you think about the beginning of how to win friends and influence people, Carnegie talks about how, hey, if you go into max security prisons and ask those people, are they good people? Do they deserve to be in here? Every single one of them thinks that they're a great person, that they do good for the world. And it's like, this person, murdered 20 people. Like they're not a good person at all. But everyone views themselves as the hero of their own story in a lot of ways. I think about like, we have a lot of blind spots. Even if you look at neurology, when you look at a person's face right side up, your brain actually makes them somewhat better looking than they actually are. And when you look at someone upside down, you actually see what they really look like and you notice all of the asymmetries and abnormalities. So we're sort of biased towards really as a species, like some kind of a rose tinted glass view of the world and each other until we get slapped in the face with like undeniable evidence. And I think about who are the people that actually reach the top of things. And oftentimes they're just really hungry, ambitious people. And I think that comes with a profile of what ultimately makes that person up. And there is like the hunger side, the drive side, the tenacity side that gets you up there. But it also usually rides along with like some ugly stuff too, like a really dark side, some
Yep.
sort of like some taboo thing that person keeps in a corner or a closet or somewhere. And then all of a sudden it gets exposed and we're like, oh my God, how could Tiger Woods have been
Yep.
sleeping with all of these women? How could Michael Jordan have this gambling problem?
Yep.
How could these politicians all be doing these insane things? Like, and it's kind of like, are we really asking this question over and over again? Like, you don't realize that this is a human. It's almost like they're not normal. Like they represent this subtype of person that actually has the tenacity, hunger, drive, follow through to actually reach this level. And I don't necessarily know if it means that they're like unbelievably competent in the skill set that's associated with best practice in this region of whatever form of work it is that they got to. They're just the type of person that conquers. That's what you're looking at. You're looking at a conqueror, and conquerors rape and pillage and murder, and they take what they want, and they really don't care about what you have to say about it, and they will do anything for the end result. And that's just what they are. You just don't like seeing the reality of the full human, but it's like you want to hold all of the pros in one hand and you want to ignore the negatives in the other hand. And I don't think it works that way. I think that, but we're so afraid to, pull the curtain back and let the light come in and actually take a look at the whole thing. We would greatly prefer to save our like fragile little appraisal brains from the pain of realizing that, like, oh, there's a dark side to everything. Like there's that yang to the yin, and neither can really work without each other, I don't think. It's fear that like kind of is the blocker. And eventually there will be an event that exposes reality, just that reality is hidden because we just don't want the real story. We don't want the whole thing. It reminds me of, like, what was it? A Few Good Men. Like, you can't handle the truth, so to speak. So that's just kind of where my mind gets led to with that concept.
It's interesting, my interpretation of The Wizard of Oz. I see it, at least my interpretation based on your writing. And I want to ask you a little bit more your thought. Are we overcomplicating things as a practice? And let me be more precise. Science and technology. Dan Pfaff, my mentor, would say, have first principle knowledge before you're the quote unquote GPS guy. I always say, pull back the cover. Is that happening in sport right now? Do those individuals that are running the technology side understand first principles knowledge, physics, psychology, biomechanics? That to me is like pulling the curtain back, right? And I'm not saying that's happening everywhere, but those were the ideas that I got. Also in this, you said, when you meet the people at the top of the food chain and what they do and the explanations they have for why things work. Explanations. You and I talked off the air about theories, right? There's two ways to have a better theory. You provide a better explanation and it's tested more. Right?
Yep.
So my first part I want to ask you is that pulling the curtain back. Do you see that in sports now? Like having that first principle knowledge. We're going to talk about biomechanics and the depth that you have and the eye and the lens that you look through, and it's world renowned. But do you feel that's happening?
It's funny because, like, if you listen long enough, people will tell you exactly who they are and what they know. And it's funny, like, even at the very top of the food chain, there'll just be someone will open their mouth and start talking, and I'll hear something and I'm like, oh, there's the chink in the armor right there. And now I can, it's almost like that first string becomes loose on the sweater and it just starts unraveling. But here's the thing, like, to me, it's tricky. I think that a lot of people that actually have no idea what they're talking about behind why things work still oftentimes get the job done. They just their rationalization of why it's working is just wrong, but they still actually plug in pretty appropriate things.
Sure.
It's just this land of heuristics that you get into. So it's like, I try to be careful with that. Like, a lot of times I'll hear someone say something and I'm like, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about. But then I actually just look at what they're doing and I'm like, okay, well, you're checking all the important boxes of what you need to do with the people that you're working with. So, I think that's tricky. And they might be doing something else that's really effective, that is really the thing that actually matters. I think about this with personal training in Manhattan, because I got into that world, and that's a crazy world. It just makes no sense. I get there and I see what's happening. I see what these rich people are doing in their workouts with these trainers. And you talk about senseless, just insane things. It's like, what am I looking at here? Like I remember seeing this guy come in, and the first exercise that he did with the trainer, they stood on a BOSU ball. The guy put towels around a barbell, held the towels, and was doing hammer curls with the barbell. Exercise 1, the most prioritized drill. And in my head, I'm like, what adaptation is this driving? What category of development is this fitting in? I'm so outside of the realm of whatever. Is there a thought process on this? Like, where'd this exercise even come from? Did it just get pulled out of the ether? Like, and so, and then I'm like, well, what comes next? What's the next movement? And the next movement was actually like holding the battle rope and jumping down, doing a burpee, getting up and doing a jumping jack with the battle rope. And I'm like, so I'm left just kind of like, analyzing things from like a physiology and a mechanics perspective. And I'm missing the forest through the trees, to tell you the truth. Okay. Because in reality, what I'm looking at here is I'm actually looking at this trainer who is a very physically attractive person with a great smile and tons of charisma. And the client is smiling from ear to ear and enjoying this process. And they're going to come 3 times a week because of how much they love this person. And they'll probably come for years at a time. Meanwhile, I can't get anyone to enjoy 5 seconds of working with me. So who's actually good? And like, what's the variable that actually matters? You know what I mean? And so I always think about that, like, oh God, I'm all over here thinking about, I can't even imagine the explanation that this trainer would have for why this is happening. Meanwhile, the actual success they're having is 10 times better than what I would have with that population.
Isn't it crazy how it works? 2 things that I think about: big arms, big legs, and hollow heads don't make great coaches. But at the end of the day, that guy's getting his bills paid, or girl, right? It comes back to, whenever I think about these exercises that you and I talk about, or that you were talking about with the Bosu ball. It's the old Patrick Ward 3 words that I think it was a long time ago he presented it. I think it was in New York City. So whenever I think of putting anything in a menu item, first thing I want to think about is the adaptation. Then I want to think about the method, and the last thing I want to think about is the exercise. And it's just interesting how I think about that. But it brings up a good point. That person's coming back.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this trainer was way more successful than me, you know? And I started thinking about it, like, what actually matters for success in this? It's not the things that I value. It's, probably being physically attractive. I noticed that above and beyond all other variables for success as a Manhattan personal trainer. If you're a better looking human, you're going to be successful. Okay. From there, it's kind of like, are you friendly, fun, and have cool clothes? I think that those were the things that mattered. And meanwhile, I'm stuck on a series of variables that are, from the impact hierarchy perspective, low impact variables, despite the fact that I can explain why I'm doing everything that I'm doing. So, but I think at the same time, if you're in charge, you know what I mean?
Yep.
You should really know how things work and why they work. And I think in more mature fields, like, I'm actually kind of obsessed with McDonald's, to tell you the truth. I talk about McDonald's a lot because I would bet, and I might be wrong, it might be Wizard of Oz. And maybe I need to get inside the world of McDonald's to actually see it. But I'm so impressed that they can consistently employ the least talented, least, sophisticated people everywhere in the world and provide a standardized product in all of their locations. So to me, like, the systematization of the supply chain in terms of the construction of the facilities, the construction of the kitchens, the electronics that communicate, the trucking, the shipping, the farming, the refrigerating of all of the different, the lettuce, the tomatoes, the chicken, the meat, the buns, like, it's got to be an unbelievable logistical, I can't imagine all of the pieces that go into making a single McDonald's work, let alone however millions of them probably around the planet at this point. And they all provide basically the exact same product with, literally, $12 an hour employees that may or may not have graduated from high school. That is impressive to me. And I
Yep.
bet you if I ask the people that really are at the top of the food chain, hey, how does this work? Why do you do it this way? They'll probably go for hours telling me about the actual supply chain, the systematic approach that McDonald's uses, the future direction that they're going to go in, the forecasting of this, and this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I say to myself, that's a mature industry approach with people that like really know how to run things.
Let me ask you this question. I'm going to interject, and I want your opinion on this McDonald's
Yeah.
thing. And I'm going to give a paraphrase quote from a colleague of ours, Buddy Morris. Do we overcomplicate things? And I'm talking now strength and conditioning. We athletes, so you train athletes. Do we overcomplicate things, or does everyone need a quote unquote hamburger? And here's what I mean by that. Right?
Yeah.
I understand. Like you got to squat, you got to push, you got to press, compound movements, multi-joint movements. Right? Not everyone's a snowflake, but there is a need for individualization. I'm going to paraphrase this quote from Buddy Morris. Simple programs can work for beginners, for and advanced level athletes, but for very different reasons. Young Tommy, who squats like a wilted candle, needs progression. He needs overload. He needs a simple program. Take the professional hockey player that's had 12 years of training under his belt. He needs a simple program, but for very different reasons. The majority of his central nervous stress needs to come from his sport. How does he get good at playing the sport? He's got to play the sport. If he's in the weight room, perhaps he has less touches in the weight room because in order to pull the homeostatic wire, he needs more weight, he needs more stimulus, and then he needs more rest. So a simple program may work wonders for that individual as well. Hey, just give him a hamburger. Now my question is, do you thoughts about that comment? Yes, no, dig deeper if you will. A lot to it. Sorry.
No. I love the question. I think that we lack a unifying principle for exercise selection and progression as a field.
Okay.
And like the next book I want to write is trying to propose a unifying principle for that. I call it ground is what I go with. So here's my starting statement on this. Like ground to me is a combination of two variables. One of them is external support and the other one is neurological feedback. Okay. So the more external support that you are working with and the more neurological feedback you're getting from touching things, the more ground there is associated with the activity.
Sure.
Okay, so I have a continuum for athletes that's a ground continuum. So there's athletes that interact with a lot of ground and minimal ground on the other side.
Okay.
So minimal ground interaction athletes would be half pipe skateboarders, snowboarders, divers, to name a few. Like peak ground interaction athletes would be power lifters, interior linemen in football, maybe like sumo wrestlers, something along those lines.
Yep.
The characteristics that allow low ground athletes to dominate is the best of the best are able to turn and tumble better than the other ones. On the complete other end of the spectrum, the high ground athletes, they're better able to not get turned and to not be tumbled.
Yep.
All right. So I think that the thing that allows you to not get turned and to not be tumbled is generally getting bigger, more massive.
Yep.
And I think that has nothing to do with your ability to turn or tumble on the other side of the spectrum. And then all other sports are kind of somewhere in between, so soccer somewhere in the middle, lacrosse somewhere in the middle, basketballs, and even inside of a given sport, you have different levels of ground positions. Like football's an easy one. You have basically the closer you are to the ball, the more ground you interact with, and the further you get to the perimeter, the less ground you interact with.
Sure.
I think even in a sprint, it's like the beginning of the sprint is just more ground interaction, and the end of this, like middle to end of the sprint, is less. And the characteristics of what would make you good at the different stages of a sprint are different. You kind of start off with strength being fairly important in the beginning, and by the time you're at like 20 meters, it doesn't make any bit of difference at all. It's like your elasticity and things like that. So, I think that ultimately, to me, I'm just a big believer that whatever you're doing, you need to do it right. It needs to be done well.
Sure.
And getting people to perform training movements well is challenging. And I think that the easiest way to get people to perform training movements in the beginning well is to make them very grounded. Like as much ground in the exercise as I can build into it. I have all these avenues of ground that I think about. Like the ones that I have are I want you to start with a bilateral stance. I want you to start in the sagittal plane. I want you to start with most of the parts of your body static, if possible. I want to start with maximum constraints, which are basically like passive blockers that don't allow you to move in a given direction. So, like machines, for instance, have a ton of constraints. Maximum references, so as many things touching you as possible. I'll start you with short levers. I'll start by utilizing load. Sometimes putting load in a given place for the person is great for neurological feedback or for anchoring part of their body to the ground. It's kind of like if I anterior load your squat, you're shifting your weight back,
Yep.
which is going to sink you into your heels more. Maximum reactive neuromuscular training, RNT, and also minimizing the challenge of managing gravity. So to me, that's like it's easier to walk than it is to run. It's easier to stand still than it is to walk. It's easier to sit than it is to stand. And it's easier to lay down than it is to sit. If I'm looking at someone and what I'm looking at is just terrible, to me, I'm like, well, I don't really want to try to yap, and coach this person more. I want to go to the exercise selection and construction side of the toolbox. And I want to construct something that builds in more of these avenues of ground. Like, for instance, if I'm in a knee dominant pattern, a low ground exercise could be something like a rear foot elevated split squat with the rear foot in a TRX strap, and a high ground knee dominant exercise could be a hack squat.
Yep.
So think about a hack squat. It just builds like all of the things into it. It's easier to manage gravity because you're laying back into the thing. It's got constraints. It's on tracks. It can only go up and down. Everything is actually in this thing. Your arms are in a short lever. It's just literally all the pieces are in this thing. And it's kind of like, why am I doing this? Like I look at it like with every exercise, there are target tissues or target effects that are supposed to be the trained outcome for the drill. And there's also cost of doing business for doing any drill. So you're going to get things that you don't want. And so like, I don't care how well you're training, you can have perfect form, perfect program design. You're still going to get things like inflammation. Like it's nobody's training for it, but it's just the cost of doing business. But I think that if we make better selections that the person is competent with, that they're going to get the primary outcome and will reduce the secondary side effect cost of doing business pieces. And it's all probabilities. You know what I mean? I think that there's a million people that can do something that's, challenging. They can do it right. But, I've been around long enough. I've coached enough people. Most people suck at exercise. If I feature all these ground pieces, my chances that the person's actually going to hit the target tissue with the least amount of coaching intervention goes through the roof. It's like I'm like, I dare you to do a hack squat and not feel your quads work. I dare you. I double dog dare you. And I'm sure that there's somebody out there that's going to do it, but I feel like it's just way more likely that I'm going to hit the thing and I'm not going to hear them say like, oh yeah, my back, my neck, my this, my that, as long as I choose reasonable weights, blah, blah, blah. So, what I would do is I'd ultimately identify this athlete belongs to this level of ground. And I'm going to try to get them to train with exercises that correspond to approximately that level of grounding in the weight room. But I'm going to start them with very high ground. And then I just strip away ground until they're in this chute of, 60% ground, 30% ground, 85% ground. And once they're in that chute, now I just go into old school exercise science, quantitative progressive overload program design, all the stuff that people are pretty familiar with. But I think that, I would just say not all athletes look the same, perform the same, are the same, and the extremes point this out. Yep. If I were to take the starting left guards from the NFL teams and ask them to drop into the half pipe on the skateboard ramp, they'd probably all get killed. You know what I mean? If I was to take all of the guys that are going to compete in the Olympics in the half pipe of the skateboard ramp and say, hey, you guys got to play left guard in the NFL, they're probably all going to get killed. And they're probably going to be good at completely opposite things. So, that to me is, I always go to the extremes to try to actually find the middle.
Yep. Today's episode has been brought to you by Physical Preparation for Ice Hockey, Biological Principles and Practical Solutions, and the Gain Go Grow Manual. This is a 2-part book series exploring training the intermediate and advanced level players. Book number 1 explores training the intermediate player. Chapters include long-term athletic development, considerations, speed training, power training, strength training, and program design. The Gain Go Grow Manual explores training the high-performance hockey player. Chapters include biomechanics of ice hockey, considerations for high performers, minimizing adaptational risks while upsizing gains, the Gain Go Grow model, and example microcycles. More information can be found at Amazon.com. I like this idea. I like this idea of layering exercises based on ground. So let's just take a hockey player. Okay, I mean, you're playing on ice, minimal coefficient of friction. Like that friction looks like my hairline. Yeah, you have an athlete that has training age, right? You've got 5-6 levels. Do you start? Is it more of a 1 divided by n approach where you start with lots of ground? Maybe it's a bilateral back squat, and then you slowly shift to more single leg unsupported, or do you say, hey, no, we got to meet this guy or she where they're at. Let's take that ground away and go right away, right there. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I start them with high ground. Everybody starts with high ground. Yep. My skateboarders, my divers. I can't think of anything that's more low ground than diving, but they need to start with the highest ground thing. I have all my patterns of training, and for every pattern, I just have a ground spectrum and continuum. And it's like, I want you to do the thing that's deeper down into the progression list of removing ground, but I don't think you're going to do it very well on day one. I needed to form a really strong memory of what the essence of the thing is.
Sure.
I kind of talk about if I'm going to teach a 5-year-old how to shoot a basketball, there's many shot types that I could select from. I could choose sky hook, 3-pointer, half court, over the backboard. But, I'm probably going to increase the probability if I go like angled layup, you know? So I'm always looking for what's the angled layup for whatever subtype of exercise it is. And we start there and then we kind of like build from there. But I personally wouldn't start with something that's, more complex. We can always get there. What's the rush?
A great point. And it reminds me a little bit. I'm stealing this idea from you. The way I looked at it is more the layering of, is it Bondarchuk, the general preparation, specific preparation, then competition exercises? And
sounds about right. Yeah.
It sounds something like that, right? But the way I viewed it is, okay, the general prep is going to be our more grounded base. Then the specific is going to be less grounded. Then that competition is really getting back on the ice. The challenge, right? The less ground you work with, the less load you can establish on the athlete. Am I accurate when I say that?
100%.
Right.
I think that as soon as we go, the more that we're towards high ground, the more we're going to get the traditional neuromuscular adaptations.
Yes.
Hypertrophy. And the further we go away from it, honestly, I don't even know what the hell the adaptations are. But I think there's something like motor control based.
100%. I do too. I believe that. I mean, we have some loaded hockey skating patterns that if I showed you on Instagram, or you'd be like, Anthony, what the hell are you doing? And it's more just patterns, getting that pattern for time, isometrically holding that pattern for time, tempo in that. I couldn't give you the physiology behind it, but I think it's important as a quote unquote, more specific based prepped exercise, less coefficient of friction, focusing on isometric, quasi-isometric contractions. Again, maybe it's my mind running off on me here, but I do like that layering of ground and less ground. I'm stealing that from you, and I'm going to start compartmentalizing our exercises accordingly.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of everything. I've always been like, hey, I share as much of my thoughts as I can for free. I still need to make a living as kind of a thinker, but like, I want this stuff to get out there because I just like to see things work. To tell you the truth, I also just like interacting with people that love training. And it's kind of like, hey, man, I get this cool thing. I think you're going to like it. I love hearing that sort of a thing. And, the other thing I was just thinking of is, like, to me, like the idea of the low ground people, and I really do kind of believe it, like with most low ground sports that I think of, and hockey's different, like, because there's a lot of different levels of it with the different players. Like, I don't think Wayne Gretzky would be even close to high ground. He's like a super low ground guy. He's not initiating contact. He's weaving, he's maneuvering. But then like some of like the big bad defensemen or something like that, there's a lot of ground with big the way that they play. It's like
net front presence, pushing people away. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
But when I think about the ultimate end of low ground, it's kind of like on ice, anyways. It would probably be figure skating. And the person that wins in figure skating is generally the person that rotates more times in the air than the other people. It's like, oh, that guy did the quadruple axel. He's getting the gold. And so I always think to myself, well, what kinds of things spin? And like, boom, a top spins. And I say like, well, what would make a top spin faster? Because if it was like a top spinning contest, because that's kind of what a lot of these sports are. Like diving is a top spinning contest for the most part. Gymnastics, when they are up in the air and they're spinning around, I'm like, I don't think putting more weight on the top of it would make it spin faster. So it's like, and I also think to myself, like, I wonder what the skateboard combine would look like, like if we tested those athletes, like, let's put 225 on the bench and see how many times they can do it. Oh, he did it 0 times, 0 times, 0 times. So like what actually matters, like, well, the sport's showing you what matters when they go up in the air and they do a 1080 and like, I mean, if you listen to the announcers in skateboarding, you want to literally, go insane or something like, oh, that was a goofy style 1080 kick switch reversed. Like, you're like, excuse me? Like, what happened there? What did I just watch? But generally speaking, the guy that goes up and revolves more times in the air wins. And then I look at him and I'm like, I don't think that guy could squat plates on the bar, but
so true.
He can do this unbelievably well. I think that it probably comes down to like coordination, precision, proprioception, body control, and probably being in a sweet spot of body composition.
I just wrote a blog about it, actually. I just read an article sent by my brother on Nikita Kucherov. He's arguably the best player in the game right now in the National Hockey League. Elite talent. And it talks about his summer training. And it doesn't talk much about anything he does in the gym at all. He's relentless on the ice. He practices pattern recognition, wall work, skill work, not conditioning, wall for countless hours. At times on the ice, 5 to 6 times a week, which would be unheard of, right? And I hear this from the community: get off the ice, rest your hockey muscles, this and that. I do understand there's a time for strength and conditioning. I'm passionate about it. But I truly feel at that level, if there's something that has to give, in my opinion, as much as I love the weight room, it's got to be an ice touch in place of the skill work, because that's where they make their living.
Right.
If that makes any sense at all.
Makes perfect sense.
We hear it a lot. Like, I would give the opposite advice for young 12-year-old Tommy. He's built like a coat hanger. He's got to get in the gym. He's got to get strong. He's got to be an athlete. But when you get to that level, you're the gold medalist snowboarder, half pipe. How do you get good at something? How do you practice the skills? Like, no one would tell Axl Rose, take the entire summer off and focus on your finger strength and then come back and play a Guns N' Roses concert.
Yeah.
But I feel like sometimes that's what happens in strength. And by the way, I'm not anti. This is how I make a living. Like, I love strength and conditioning. I thrive on it. But at that level, the skill, context, target environment, right? Like, you got to do it.
It's funny. I think to myself, like, how much people make fun of Tom Brady's training, and maybe deservedly so. But I also think that he probably avoided doing things that would have given him adaptations that may have been negative, because
Well,
I don't think he needs a lot of high ground based adaptations. He doesn't need hypertrophy. And if he gained some of those things, it may have been very counterproductive. I
yeah,
think that, look, like Tiger Woods is an interesting story. I don't know if it's purely psychological or what with him, but he trained like a savage.
yep,
But you really don't need to do that, I don't think, for golf. Like, we kind of see
yep,
that over and over again. Like, DeChambeau gets gigantic, but he's not the guy winning all the time. Like,
yep.
you get a guy like John Rahm that wins way more often, and he looks like he could just be like, third guy on the left at the Thanksgiving table or something like that. You're like, wait, who did he marry? Did he marry my cousin Susie? Like, what's going on? Oh, he's an elite golfer? Like, like, are you kidding me?
No,
So it's like you see all these silly exercises that exist.
yep,
I mean, it's very easy to make fun of, and I do it as much as anybody else.
yep,
But I think to myself, at the very least, that exercise is probably not doing anything. And
sure.
that can be beneficial sometimes, because I don't know if all of the adaptations that we create with actually stimulating exercises are always productive. They can be counterproductive.
So well put, man. So well put. And by the way, it brings me to a point, and I do want to get to biomechanics next, but you talk about this idea, and this is more central adaptations and peripheral adaptations, but I always come back to this. Like Lance Armstrong you could say he was doping, he wasn't doping. He was one of the best cyclists in the world ever. And at the time, he was arguably, everyone was doping. But he
Yeah,
finished 786th in the Boston Marathon. Like he didn't train to run. His peripheral
right.
adaptations didn't train. So I always come back to that. I'm not, again, that's not saying don't train. That's not what I mean. But it is interesting that analogy that you talked about, high ground and Tom Brady and those adaptations that very well are wise that he didn't work on, possibly, if he did that kind of training to begin with. But I want to pivot here. This is
Yep.
your wheelhouse, man, and I know you could just go on and on about this. I want to talk about biomechanics. I mean, you've had massive influences, and you go so deep into biomechanics. I've had opportunities to have one-off conversations with you, but I want to start with this. Who have been your biggest influences in your biomechanics? I know PRI, I know DNS. Who are some personal mentors? Where do
Yeah.
you get your theory, like the hamster wheel running around your head right now? Who's involved in your thought process?
Yeah, I mean, Bill Hartman's been the biggest influence on me of anybody in the field mechanically. I think that, like, I love Bill because he's just in his own world. You know what I mean? Like, when you have an opportunity to like experience him for a little bit, it's just kind of like you just get to visit this like alien planet in some ways. And I mean that is like the highest compliment possible. And it's like, what's been banging around in there? And like, how much of this am I going to understand even? Like, I need like the Rosetta Stone to be able to try to like, but like whatever fraction of his thoughts like actually get into my brain, it's just like it makes my brain kind of go crazy. And then I'm like, oh my God, like I'm seeing everything differently. And it's like my brain, I think, works differently because I'm just obsessed with systems and standardization and like organization and
Yep.
just building models. But without a doubt, he's been the major influence on me
Okay.
from a thought process perspective. And then I think that, like, the big thing that he stated at a seminar was hearing him say, write out your model, and when I did that, it was the beginning of what turned into the whole book and the seminars and everything else. And really, like, I kind of dove into a lot of the literature on that topic. And that's kind of like, to me, it's sort of like you get into like Daniel Kahneman stuff
Yep.
and Robert Greene mastery stuff. And it's all this process of going from your intrinsic knowledge and making it extrinsic and then returning back to intrinsic. And like nobody writes out their model to like a really thorough degree. Like you just operate. You're just in your day-to-day life and you're getting the job done. And you don't really analyze like, well, what do I actually do? how am I doing it? Why am I doing it? And I think that if you unpack that completely and kind of do an inventory, and like, you're going to find that you're going to encounter a number of things like that you're going to keep and that you might throw away. And then when you get to the how and why questions, sometimes you're like, oh, this is a tough one. And I think that my brain probably is always working like a cross-examining lawyer, like inside my own head of like, you better justify this, or it's, I really
That's
take the
awesome.
things that
That's
people have
awesome.
said,
Yeah.
back in the day. Like, I take that very seriously. I don't know who the first person was to say it, but it was kind of like, if you can't give a good reason for why something's in your program, you got to throw it out.
Yep.
And I think that I just take that to the farthest level possible. And I start asking myself, well, why? And after asking that a couple of times, almost like a little kid pestering you, but happening inside my own head, I kind of find myself getting to the end of my understanding or explanation for something. And if that's not good enough, well, then I have to either learn more, or I realize that this is something that needs to kind of go. A lot of it, I think, is actually like, somebody was asking me recently, like, who are your mentors? And I said, Bill definitely is, and books.
Yeah. So true. Yeah. It leads me to writing out your model. So your model, rethinking the big patterns. That
Yeah.
was your model. What is
Mhm.
rethinking the big patterns? Why does it matter to strength coaches?
Yeah. I thank God I've been able to teach this thing as many times as I have now. And like, it's
Yep.
been around for a few years for me to be able to actually give the answer to that. Because before I would have been like, I don't know, man, I wrote a book, like there's a lot in this thing. But I kind of now realize, like, what did I build? And it's an algorithm for exercise selection. It's an algorithm for exercise progression, and it's an algorithm for determining whether or not the exercise was done with competency. So, to me, like, I say that my enemy is arbitrary decision making. And I never want to make arbitrary decisions for anything that I do. And like, this is like the one time that I ever say anything that might be considered picking on Coach Boyle, because
Yep.
I think that Mike Boyle has been one of the biggest influences on me, thought wise, of anybody ever. But sometimes I think it's hey, what exercise do we do on day one for knee dominant? Well, we do the rear foot elevated split squat. And the reason is because 80% of people that come in on day one can do it right. And I start saying, like, who's doing the math on this?
Yep.
And how are we defining it as being done right? Because those are hard questions, actually.
Sure.
And so I start saying to myself, like, all right, I don't know if I'm going to ever use an 80-20 rule, because now I'm probably biasing it with what I want it to be, really.
Yep. Yep.
And now I really have to start justifying, like, what do I mean by done right? Can I
Sure.
actually have a checklist that would define right and wrong? So, I think, like, I wanted to give people a much more principle based guideline for actually choosing exercises, so that they can avoid the emotional bias towards what they like, and actually kind of just remove themselves from that entirely and just make decisions completely based on. I'm always stuck after, like, I'm like, it's an algorithm for exercise selection, it's an algorithm for exercise progression, it's an algorithm for whether or not the exercise is done right. But what is an algorithm? Because it's a word that gets thrown around. And an algorithm is a logic tree. And a logic tree is a series of if this, then that question and answers.
Yep.
So it's like, number one, exercise selection. I say, well, what population does this person belong to? I've got three populations: general population, athletes, special populations. What's a special population? Long story short, someone that is currently experiencing joint pain or an injury.
Got it.
All right. What's an athlete? Somebody that actually competes in sports.
Yep.
What's a general population? Personal training client. Okay. What's the playbook the primary playbook for general population people. They're usually training for body composition, so they get resistance training, compound exercises, and locomotion. The resistance training drills are done in moderate load, moderate velocity for moderate duration. Okay. They're enough to stimulate hypertrophy. The locomotion stuff is usually moderate or under from a loading standpoint, moderate or under from a velocity standpoint, and moderate to long from a duration standpoint. That's their playbook.
Yep.
That's their whole playbook.
Yep.
All right. Like I maybe sprinkle in something, running, jumping, throwing, changing directions, but that's not the primary playbook for Gen Pop.
Yep.
It's a very limited playbook.
Yep.
Okay. Then I got athletes, and I say to myself, I'm on the spectrum of high ground to low ground, and high ground is actually more on like a Gen Pop training thing.
Yep.
Like their resistance training stuff with lots of grounding in the exercise is probably the primary thing. And then as I get to moderate to low ground, the primary patterns are going to be running, triple extension, change of direction, throwing. Like that's the magic right there.
Sure.
And then the things that I actually sprinkle in are probably more of the resistance training stuff.
Got it.
Special populations, their primary training focus is actually core exercises and breathing, because I'm trying to change table tests with them and return them back to a place of actually not being special populations. And as soon as they're not special populations, they're either general population or athletes.
I can tell you, I love this classification. And I'm not interjecting, but I wanted to bring something, and I made plenty of mistakes. I think, and I'm pointing the thumb here, I think what I did when I took a lot of the PRI-based courses is that I used that special population approach with athletes. And by the way, I'm not saying you can't sprinkle in breathing, but when you're spending 25 minutes at the start of a workout, most athletes are going to say, hey, bud, like,
come on.
come on, man. Like, let's go here. I really like that. And it brings me kind of to my question regarding this, rethinking the big patterns. Are you still doing the breath work and the pattern work with healthy athletes, meaning they're non-special population, they're injured? And then my other piggyback question, I know this is a big one. Asymmetry. We are naturally asymmetric beings. Are we doing more harm than good as physical therapists and trainers by trying to make people symmetric that aren't meant to be?
Those are great questions. So like I remove all of my own decision making at this point in time, and I only plug into the algorithm at this point in time. That is my operational approach. So I say to myself, okay, athlete, and let's just say moderate ground and under. Okay.
Yep.
I say, what are the primary motor patterns that need to be developed? Running, jumping, throwing, and changing direction. Okay. The other patterns that get involved are hinging, squatting, pressing, and pulling. Okay. That's the playbook. Inside of that, there's like stances and planes of motion. So a bilateral stance, a front back stance, a lateral stance, and sagittal, frontal, and transverse. All right. And I say to myself, okay, this is a beginner athlete. So every exercise on day one that is from the categories that we're selecting is a bilateral stance, sagittal plane, high ground version of that exercise. Okay. And you might be like, how do you do running with a bilateral stance high ground? And I say, well, the first drill that we do is long seated arm action.
There you go.
That's what it is. Okay. Yep. And like on and on and on down the line, I just say, this is what actually paints the picture for me. And once you're competent with the exercise, and that's based on planes and center of mass control, and it looks right for me as an observer, and it feels right for the athlete based on like they have the right pieces of their axial skeleton that are holding them anti-gravity, and they feel the right target tissues for the exercise. Like if they're doing that and their trajectory is sending them towards more low ground, then I strip away ground a piece at a time, a piece at a time. And normally I stay within the stance and the plane first, and I remove the RNT, the references, the constraints, until I've removed so many of those things that now I change the stance first and the plane second. And I progress the stances from bilateral to front back to lateral, and I progress the planes from sagittal to frontal to transverse. So I never am ever unsure of what the next thing is. There's never a guess, and it's never even my good ideas anymore. It's literally like this algorithm always decides the thing. I say that like there's systems and then there's models and algorithms. And the difference between a system and an algorithm is, like, I actually tell it with the Frankenstein story. I take all the pieces of the body and I assemble them. It's still a system. Okay. Once I pull the switch and it comes to life, takes its breath, it starts walking. Now it's an algorithm because it's operating on its own, and I should probably just follow along and let it do its thing.
Yep.
A system is when I just have the pieces in play and I'm still doing my thing. And I don't believe that that's the best way to work, because I think human brains make bad decisions under stress and in the moment. So if you build an algorithm way in the background and historically, and now you just let that thing make all your decisions for you, I think that increases the probability of things actually working and progressing. So, that's literally just how I approach everything at this point in time. And I have 100% success rate with the interventions that I use. So when I think about, like the second question that you had with like, do I really use breathing? Do I focus on breathing? Part of the exercise progression algorithm is actually just looking at, like, I divide the skeleton of different people into two primary camps. And I have people that are wide infrasternal angle people and people that are narrow infrasternal angle people.
Yep.
And the people that are wide have an overall skeleton that's biased towards compressive activities. And the people that are narrow have a skeleton biased towards expansive strategies.
Sure.
And if I were to label the things that are compressive strategies, there's joint actions associated with them: extension, adduction, internal rotation, dorsiflexion, and pronation. That's the family of joint actions that ride along with that. And the respiratory action that rides along with that is exhalation. Expansion is just the mirror image of that: flexion, ER, abduction, plantar flexion, supination, inhalation. So I don't look at exhalation or inhalation as any different than a joint action, to tell you the truth. So if I see that I have this athlete, they're like an O lineman, and they got a wide ass infrasternal angle, and like they're beat up and they can't move very well, and like they're just on a struggle bus right now. I say to myself, well, I'm not going to like take this big boy and like get him down and breathe him and all this sort of stuff. Like, but when I construct his exercises, I'm going to bias him a little bit more towards expansion. And so when I think about like, what would I do from his lower body stuff with a squat exercise? Well, I'm just going to feature more plantar flexion with his starting position. So I might have, like, if I've got a facility I really like, I'd probably have a pendulum squat in there. He's a high ground, big athlete, and I would just walk his feet up a little bit higher on the platform, which would just put his ankle into more and more plantar flexion. If I'm going to have him bench press, I'll probably just build the ground up underneath his feet and then move the ground away from him so that it puts his ankle into more plantar flexion. If I'm going to have him grip a bar to hold on to for squatting or hinging, I'm probably going to have him supinate his hands a little bit and ER his arms a little bit. That's how I look at it. Is it's like, to me, there's nothing magical about the ventilatory action. It belongs to one side of this spectrum of movement possibilities. And I'm just going to, for people that are great, they're in the middle, like we can play around with both things. But for people that are like significantly movement impaired and they're an athlete, I'm probably going to strongly bias the setup of their exercises towards the other strategy that they struggle with.
Is that all in rethinking the big patterns? Does that take place during the course of the educational week?
Oh yeah,
Tell the listeners where they can find more about information on that.
sure. So the book is titled A Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement, Rethinking the Big Patterns. And, it's a long book. It's got a lot in there, but it will walk you through the majority of the thought processes that I've talked about here. The one that's newer is more of the ground continuum for athletes. And that's going to, the following book will be titled something along the lines of like creating training trajectories for athletes. And that will basically walk people through the strategic approach towards classifying ground levels and then how to strategically strip away ground from your exercises. But I teach the seminars right now. I have 3 seminars: control patterns, which is breathing and core exercises; athletic patterns, which is triple extension, locomotion, change of direction, throwing; and resistance patterns, which is hinging, squatting, pressing, and pulling, as their own separate 2-day seminars. And really, it's just kind of like you get exposed to the algorithm as a thought process, work collectively as a team to see like, how would you use this facility to create different levels of ground and to challenge within these patterns. I want to see you think and create, and like we're going to feel whether or not this actually comes to life and works for you. So I think there's a link to pretty much everything that I do through my Instagram, which is Dr. Pat Davidson, Dr. Pat Davidson.
Okay, I want to chat a little bit about mass. I want to tell you a little bit about our model and how you've had massive impact on our model. For our pros, we call it the Gain, Go, Grow model. It's a 3-day rollover program by Dan Pfaff. The thought process is, and the ideas really come from Pfaff and Joe Ken, but essentially lift heavy things slowly on day 1. We complement that with acceleration work, so there'll be a high ground day. Our middle day is go. We lift sub-maximum weight for speed. That would be, complemented with really, really short stretch shortening cycle work and top end sprinting work for our athletes. And then last day would be grow, lift sub-maximal weight for time. We specifically have that on the last day of the week because athletes get a full weekend to recover from that. One of the methods that we'll use is certain blocks of your mass system. I know you might say, Anth, really, you use that for some of your athletes? We do, and we love it. We use escalating density means, we use reverse pyramids, but we love the mass program. Love it. I want to give you a compliment first, and then I want to ask you if you could give us a kind of a synopsis on that program. The ebook itself is masterfully written. You got a gift for writing. I just love the way it was written. It's awesome.
Yeah.
The program itself is potent. Oh my goodness, boy. That'll make a bulldog break his chain. You got more kick than a garlic milkshake in that thing. You better put your boots on, man. You better put your boots on. You better put your work boots on that program. We specifically do it at the very end of the week because it's a ball buster, excuse the French. Mm-hmm. Tell me how that mass program came about. Tell me where our listeners can learn more about it and where they can pick up a copy of the ebook.
Absolutely. Number one, like the copies, I think like everything is like the link tree and Instagram is like the ultimate like portal to everything. It can be gotten through there. Now it's funny, like original Mass won. The reality is so much better than any fiction we could ever make up. So, I had left academia. I went down to New York City. I was, teaming up with what Joe Dowdell was putting together at Peak Performance. It was supposed to be like this gigantic new mega movement and fitness. Didn't work out, but in the beginning, like Men's Health was super interested in the project. And one of their editors, Michael Easter, did a lot of stuff with us. And he hits me up and he goes, hey, we had this new intern start with us. And I got to tell you, the kid's too skinny to work for Men's Health. Okay. And, he's like, he's a cross country runner and he's got a 16-week internship. And we think it would be a really cool project to see how much mass we could put on this kid across the time of his internship. You think you could write a program for him? And I was like, yeah, I think I could do that. So I started thinking to myself about a cross-country athlete and a runner and somebody like that. I said, well, you got to be like mentally very, very tough to do that sport at a collegiate level. And you're probably obsessed with times, and you're probably obsessed with like PRing inside of time scales. And so I think I'm going to build everything based on time. I think that'll connect with his psychology and challenge him, and like he'll like it. So, and he's also a beginner. So it's like, I don't want him to start off with loads that are going to be too high. I think, how can I constrain the loads to being pretty light, but like massacre him at the same time with these things? So it was kind of like, all right, well, let's start off with like the work to rest being one that will feature more reps, but not much rest. Like we're going to take advantage of this guy's strengths in some ways, which is probably his aerobic system and his tenacity, but we're going to work inside of that to be able to challenge him with resistance. So the 30-30 was the first one that kind of got dropped, and it was the 10 exercise. And the other part of it is I thought to myself, I can't be there and watch this guy every day. I don't want him to get hurt. I think that if I make more exercises in the beginning, it spreads the stress out. So he can do things wrong and not hurt himself because he'll be hinging and squatting and pushing and pulling and one leg and two legs and this direction, that direction, horizontal, vertical, and it won't be that heavy. So even if it's terrible, it'll still be good. So yeah, the 10 exercise thing, I need you to get 15 reps at each station, and then you get 30 seconds to be able to get ready for the next station. And you get the minute break in between rounds. And the whole point of it is, what's the most amount of weight that you can possibly lift for the whole thing, which creates a degree of like, everyone that does it always is trying to strategize about it. It's like, oh, I think if I put more weight on the trap bar, I'll be able to do it. And then I'll subtract a little bit from this one. Like, so everyone starts to game it. You know what I mean? They're like, and that gets them like involved. They feel like they've got agency. And I mean, honestly, like I always thought it would be really fun to combine it with gambling too. If you got people gambling on it. And so, like all the other ones were just offshoots of that in some way, shape, or form, where like it kind of progressed load across the different phases of it. And the time started to increase your rest and decrease the work window. So that's kind of the basic premise of it originally. So originally it was literally just Tony's training program from Men's Health. And that kid had amazing results from it. He gained 24 pounds across the 16 weeks. Yeah. And the funny thing though was like, I said to myself, I want to make sure that I can help this kid if he's struggling with it. So I just started doing the program with him. And then a couple of the guys that were at Peak started doing it with me. And I remember we shared a couple of videos and other people were like, what are you doing, man? And I was like, I'm doing this workout. And so I tried to make it a little bit cooler. And so I started calling it Operation Drago originally. And like, hey, we're gonna do this to fight Ivan Drago at the end of it.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing was Men's Health, they were kind of like, hey, we've been planning on doing this story on Peak because we're going to call it like the future of gyms or something like that. And they're like, we actually think it would be cool to do a tag along story with that and to call this like best program of the year because of the results that this kid's been getting from it. And so I started saying to myself, man, I'm going to get the ultimate free advertising that anybody could ever get, but I don't have a product with it. I better write something up to actually correspond to this, or I'm an idiot. And
Sure.
so I just sort of like feverishly wrote that thing out over the course of like 3 days, that original book. And it just turned into its own thing, really.
It's outstanding. The writing, it's just it's masterful. The stories, the chapters, fantastic. And we use a lot of your ideas. Our last day of the week, mass.
Mm.
A lot of the stuff is DNA all over it. So, thank you for that. You've done a lot in this industry. So I want to wrap up with this question. And now you might say, really, Anthony, you educate people. You're a good human being. You challenge people in good ways. You talk the talk. You walk the walk. How do you want to be remembered legacy wise in our business?
It's funny. I just don't ever really think about that, to tell you the
Fair
truth.
enough. Fair
You
enough.
know, it's a good question, but like, I'm always just sort of like, I'm just not satisfied with anything. Like that's just kinda like how I am. Like I'm just like, it's funny. I remember like when I finished PhD, I defended the dissertation, everything was done. People were like, "Wow, you must be real happy about that." I was like, I guess. I don't know. Like it's just done. Okay. I'm like on to the next thing, you know? And so I just feel like that kind of is me. Like I don't get excited about much, like it takes a hell of an experience for me to really feel like fired up about it. In person coaching or something like that, I'm a lot more of like a Bill Belichick kind of a guy
Yep.
than I would be rah rah in any way, shape, or form, and just very much like the only thing I really care about is just building something fucking awesome, you know. And then once it's done, and then it's like every time something's done, it always just feels disappointing in some way. It's
Yeah.
almost like, well, I kind of miss building that thing, but I'm exhausted and I don't know what I want to build next. It better be something pretty cool. And so I don't know. I guess that when I think about it, like I just want to be remembered as somebody that's like a real, like just very real person, like as a person too.
Ha!
You know,
I like that.
like
Damn right, man. You are. You
yeah,
are. I can tell
like
you that right
I
now.
got, I got my pros and I got my cons. I'm probably not easy to deal with. I'm not employable at all. You know what I mean? I have a lot of things that are just like the full spectrum of everything. And I don't come from a pretty picture. I might not end in a pretty picture, but that's my reality. And I don't shy away from that reality. And I think I just like to put that out there. In a lot of ways, I think just because like I'm probably a low probability success story. And I think I'd love to see other people that are probably low probability success stories actually see like, man, this guy, like if I actually know the truth behind this guy, like it's not that different than my truth. Like I'm from kind of a rough town or something like that. And like I had a bad run of it. And, if this person could do it, then maybe I could, if I get my shit together, I might be able to do it too. But at the same time, the work's never done, you know?
Yeah.
Like as soon as you start thinking you've done something good, you start slipping. And before you know it, a lot of parts of your life can start slipping. So it's like, I don't know. Like I don't know if that exactly summarizes it, but that's just like where my brain goes to it, something like that.
Our guest today has been Dr. Pat Davidson. Pat, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.